That said, I would still expect Thresh Nasus, Watcher Control, and Frostbite Midrange to be one of, if not the most popular lineups going into Top Cut. I think that the most amount of players are going to qualify with a lineup like that. And you could also trade out the Frostbite Midrange for the Lee Sin, which I do like a little bit more. Lee Sin is better against aggro than something like the Frostbite Midrange. Well, that didn't age particularly well. And while I got it wrong, I wasn't as far off as it may seem. So the most popular lineup going into Top Cut actually was Lissandra, Nasus, Aesol Demacia at 8 players. And then number 2 is you take out the Aesol Demacia, you put in the Lee Sin, and there were only 3 players on that one. Now, I expected Frostbite Midrange, Nasus, and Lissandra to be the most popular lineup going into top 32, and actually none of the top 32 qualified with that lineup. While I said that I liked the Lee Sin more than the Frostbite Midrange, I did predict that Frostbite Midrange was going to be the most popular, and instead, nobody actually ran that lineup. The 4 Frostbite Midrange that we do have in here, none of them pairing that with Nasus and Lissandra, usually just one or the other, sometimes neither. Kind of got that one wrong, but I did get the number 2 lineup. I'll take that, honestly, because guessing lineups is kind of hard. Now, why did we see so much Aesol Demacia? I was playing ladder a lot on Friday, and I started to see it a lot more, and I was laddering with Thresh Nasus because I was trying not to play that deck and talk myself out of it, and honestly, I was going kind of 50-50-ish with the Aesol Demacia, and I think that's why so many players brought it. It is a deck that handles the Shadow Isle and Shurima portion of Thresh Nasus very well, while not being a hindrance, a weak point on your lineup like the Frostbite midranges, where if you run into triple aggro, Nasus, Lissandra, Aesol Demacia should absolutely body that, unless it is like a very specific counter to one of those decks, which a lot of players did not bring. You will notice that there is very little aggro here in the top 32. Which brings us over to top 5 decks. Nasus, Lissandra, Demacia, Aesol, Lee Sin, and Draven Ezreal. So I had mentioned a couple weeks back, I was starting to predict what are going to be the top 5 decks for the seasonal. I had predicted Lissandra, followed by Aesol Demacia, followed by a 3rd place mystery deck, and then Lee Sin I thought was going to be number 4 or 5. But the more I thought about it, I couldn't articulate what deck I thought would actually beat out Lee Sin for spot number 3, so Lee Sin just kind of defaulted to spot number 3. And that, from the beginning of the format to the end of the format, that's kind of where we ended up. And then Nasus just shot up to the number 1 spot, and Draven Ezreal rounding it out. I think I predicted Draven Ezreal to be number 5, so, actually pretty spot on, just from, not really a prediction standpoint. I'm not trying to, boast my prediction skills here. I'm trying to show you that from the start of the format to the end of the format, really nothing changed other than Nasus rising to the top. But because Lissandra and Aesol Demacia were already the 2 centerpieces of the format, and they were already starting to push aggro out more and more each week, Nasus really just solidified the pushing out of aggro and didn't warp the meta too much outside of very specifically doing that. And the results are being felt here. Obviously there's 1 Scouts, 1 discard aggro, 1 Nightfall, and that's about it in terms of aggro presence in the top 32. Prediction number 2, there will be at least 4 Draven Ezreal in Top Cut. Cool, we did it. Number 3, little to no aggro. Another kind of gimme. The predictions this time around were kind of low-hanging fruit. It was more so, can you guess the 3rd deck? And the answer was no, I couldn't do it. I could guess the 2nd most popular 3rd deck, but I could not guess the number 1 3rd deck in Aesol Demacia. But now I kind of want to talk about the actual top 32 itself. So, some things I noticed while going through these deck lists. Number 1, only about 1/3 of the Nasus players were playing some kind of anti-Nasus tech, be it Withering Wail, the Box, Vengeance. Most of them, about 2/3 of the Nasus players, were just running very standard Nasus builds. Some of them even starting to cut down on Black Spear and maybe just go a little bit more aggro. Now, when you are playing a Lissandra Nasus X lineup, my general assumption is that you are going to be handshaking and banning the Lissandra decks on both sides. And if these players are not running anti-Nasus tech, I can only assume that some of them were looking to actually leave open the Lissandra and just play into that, maybe thinking that their Aesol Demacia or their Nasus has a decent shot against it, which isn't a terrible take. As far as these 3 decks, Nasus, Lissandra, and Aesol Demacia going back and forth at each other, it's not really, none of them are countering one another. Lissandra doesn't counter Nasus. It has a 60, I'd say optimistically like a 60% win rate against Nasus, which to me countering something is like a 70-30, something where at the very least I'm taking a guaranteed 2 out of 3 games against you, right? And speaking of countering, you'll also notice that there are very little counter lineups in the top 32. And what I had mentioned on Tournament Tactician was that I feel like a lot of the counter decks, like Scargrounds, for example. Scargrounds is actually a great example of a counter deck. It does extremely well into both Nasus and Lysandra. The problem is that, one, it is a very specific counter pick. It doesn't do great into a wide variety of things. And number two, the deck is inherently pretty inconsistent. Star Spring, another great example. These counter decks don't really have the consistency to hang on through 9 rounds of play, even if you get to run into everything that you're looking to counter the entire time. There is a chance that, your deck just falters against one of the decks that you're looking to counter, and then you don't actually counter the next deck that you have to play against. Your deck decides to function that game, and you end up losing anyway. It's not like you are hard favored against Aesol Demacia as Scargrounds. The Screeching Dragon is still going to do a number on you. Hushes are in there. It's something you don't handle particularly well, is my point. So it makes sense to me that there's not a lot of counter lineups in the top 32, and I think that a lot of the solidification of the format, going from 19 unique decks in Cosmic Creation, what was considered to be a very unhealthy meta, into 16 unique decks this time around, I don't think is necessarily indicative of an unhealthy meta. More so just that 9 rounds is benefiting consistency, and there are only so many consistent decks in Legends of Runeterra. That's not to say that we're in a healthy meta, because 23 out of 32 top 32 spots is high. Definitely high. If you've watched my content before, you know that my benchmark for this deck is a little bit oppressive, is if you are consistently taking more than half of a top cut. Now, Nasus has only been around for 2 weeks in that regard of taking more than half of a top cut, so it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, Legends of Runeterra patches are locked in 2 weeks in advance. This started becoming a problem about 2.5 weeks before the patch, and that's where it was like starting to put up like numbers where I needed to put up these numbers for like 3 weeks, and then it's a problem. So the chances that we are getting Thresh Nasus nerfs, extremely low. I would also be surprised if we got Lysandra nerfs, because she wasn't putting up, terrible numbers. She actually didn't even start to take up half of a top cut until Nasus also started to take up half of a top cut. So I think that based on where things started to put up really big numbers, at least from a tournament perspective, I think it is just a little bit too late for it to actually get nerfed on the next set release. But enough of that, back to the analysis. One thing that I did want to say is that now that we have a very solid idea of what players have brought into the top 32, and I do want to mention that historically players don't swap off of decks that often from Swiss to top 32. I think for Cosmic Creation there were only like 4 or 5 players that actually changed their lineup, one of them being Majin Bey, who swapped over to Felios Tom Kench and ended up winning the seasonal. Kudos to him. But now that you have a really good idea of what the field is going to look like, now that you know for a fact you are going to be playing against at least half Nasus and Lysandra lineups, you can start to play a really greedy lineup. And what we are going to see win the seasonal, I don't think, is Nasus, Lysandra, Aesol Demacia. I think it is going to be something greedier. Now, I'm not entirely sure what that looks like. I'm pretty sure Lee Sin will be in there because, as I've been saying since the beginning of the format, I didn't think Lee Sin was that strong. It hasn't been putting up great numbers. But if a time traveler had come back to me and said, hey, Boulevard, Lee Sin won the Empires of the Ascended seasonal, I would not be surprised in the slightest. And now, looking at the top 32, once again, I would not be surprised in the slightest, because I do think that Lee Sin is favored into both Thresh Nasus and Aesol Demacia. At least that's the impact that I got from both metadata as well as my own personal experience playing in the seasonal, where I did bring Nasus, Lysandra, and Lee Sin. I really wasn't struggling to pick up wins with my Lee Sin until, I struggled a little bit with aggro. But as far as these decks that we're seeing here in the top 32, once again, very little aggro. And I don't think that you get to look at this and say, okay, people are now going to big brain it. They're going to bring super greedy lineups. How do I counter that? I big brain the big brain, and I bring the triple aggro lineup. If you do that, you are going to get stomped. There might be like 5 players that swap over to super greedy lineups, and the chances that your top 32 bracket to the finals is lined up with all 5 of those players is very low. If you swap over to triple aggro, the chances are you're going to play against one of the 27 people that didn't change their lineups and just smacks the hell out of you right out of top 32, playing Lysandra, Nasus, and Aesol Demacia. Now, so my actual predictions for the seasonal. Number 1, I think that the play rate of Lee Sin, I think, is going to go up. The play rate of Aesol Demacia, I think, is probably actually going to stay the same. I don't think too many players are really swapping off of the Nasus, Lysandra, Aesol Demacia lineup, or at least not as many as should. I think that players still think that this is a lineup they were very comfortable bringing into the mirror lineup. Now, I do think that Nasus players should start playing a little bit more for the anti-Nasus mirror, be it the box or Withering Will or Vengeance, or my personal favorite, Spirit Fire. I did meme about this a little bit on the Mastering Runeterra tournament when I was on the analyst desk for that, where we were starting to see Nasus's real big breakout performance, and I was kind of joking with Blevins about, Spirit Fire, maybe that's the next adaptation of the anti-Nasus. Let me tell you something. I ran Spirit Fire in the seasonal tournament, and I never drew it in the Nasus mirror. But if I ever did, boy, I auto won that. And the reason that I ran Spirit Fire instead of Withering Wail is because if you look at the other decks, what is the X deck that your opponent is bringing? Be it Frostbite midrange, or Lee Sin, or Aesol Demacia, whatever. Spirit Fire is better against the X deck than Withering Wail is, I want to say 10 out of 10 times, looking at the actual mid-rangey composition of what the top 32 actually is. I think that Spirit Fire is obviously going to be a lot better against Aesol Demacia than Withering Wail is, because Withering Wail is useless against Aesol Demacia, and I think that's why we saw so few Nasus players actually bring it. If you are playing against, anything other than specifically Nasus, the Withering Wail does feel like a bit of a hindrance. It doesn't even do well into Lysandra. It's really only good in exactly the mirror match, so it does make sense to me that only a third of the players were running that anti-tech. I do legitimately think that Spirit Fire is the better option in a better spread of matchups, and will also perform well enough in the Nasus mirror, also because, one, it is burst speed, two, it helps with those aggro matchup, or those aggro style of games where you're on the back foot the entire time because of the attack reduction. Yes, your opponent will still have time to slay their own units with things like Ravenous Butcher, or draw with Glimpse Beyond, or Spirit Leech, or anything like that, but I think that the attack reduction payoff and the end of round thing, still just getting like a massive slay onto your opponent's board, and a wider berth of things as well, because Bakai Reaper is still a very popular choice in these decks. And the fact that it's burst speed as well. Overall, no cap. Legitimately think Spirit Fire is a good Nasus spell to tech into your top 32 lineup. It will do you as well as Withering Wail did, more or less, in the Nasus mirror, and I promise it will perform better than Withering Wail did in any other matchup, barring aggro. And as we see here in the top 32, you're not going to see a lot of aggro. So if you do want to maintain your good Nasus mirror matchup while still beating Aesol Demacia, and you want to trust Boulevard, Spirit Fire is the way to go. I also ran Vengeance. Ran 2 Spirit Fire, 2 Vengeance. Worked great. Against Aesol Demacia, against Frostbite midrange, against Overwhelm. I was having a blast with it. Nasus mirror especially. That's my weird, off-the-wall, kooky, washed-up caster hot take for the top 32 of the seasonals. Play Spirit Fire in your Nasus deck. Now, as far as what lineup is going to win the seasonal, just because I feel like I have to make a prediction, I would guess Lee Sin, Lysandra, Nasus, because it's going to be Lysandra Nasus, and I'm pretty sure Lee Sin's going to win the seasonal, just because I've been, if for no other reason than I've been memeing about it for 4 or 5 weeks at this point, as well as I do legitimately think that the deck is good. So that's kind of my prediction. I will have a link to this spreadsheet in the description below, just so that you can get access to these deck lists if you want to take a peek through what everybody brought. As always, my name is Boulevard. Thank you so much for watching, and I will be back on Tournament Tactician on Friday. Probably just kind of going over this stuff a little bit more, nothing too crazy. See if I change any of my predictions. I don't really want to these are soft predictions. What I say on Tournament Tactician, that's a hard prediction. So tune in on Friday to see what I hard predict, and yeah, see you then.